Everyone's entitled to their own opinion. But some opinions are more useful than others. And we all want the good ones. The ones that shake things up, spark debates, and change minds. Financial Times readers know that their opinions are reliable because they're shaped by trusted journalism. Robust opinions, confident decisions. Source FT. To subscribe, go to ft.com/sourceft.
Get the Angel Reese special at McDonald's now. Let's break it down. My favorite barbecue sauce, American cheese, crispy bacon, pickles, onions, and a sesame seed bun, of course. And don't forget the fries and a drink. Sound good? Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
At participating restaurants for a limited time.
The Secret Service is moving the president underground. Congress is figuring out how to work online. When the word goes out, there will be a run on the banks, gas stations, grocery stores, you name it.
People will panic. The virus will be the least of our worries. It will tip over now.
We just need to make sure that nobody knows until everybody knows.
Hello, guys, and welcome to another episode of Hollywood Gold. I'm your host, Daniela Taplin Lundberg, and I'm here with Vanessa Mendel. I keep doing it with this accent.
Yeah, the accent's good. I like it. I think
Vanessa.
that works.
Vanessa, I'm so excited for today's episode because we get to interview a writer we've been working with, writer-director we've been working with very closely over the last year plus, Scott Burns. And we're about to dive into Contagion, which, guys, man, talk about a precursor to a major global pandemic. If you go rewatch that movie, you will be shocked about how accurate the foretelling of the film was to our actual experience. It's really, really eerie and such a testament to Scott's research and ability to understand global pandemics. So this one is going to blow your minds. Can't wait to get going.
I'm so excited for this one.
Let's go. So Scott Burns, my friend.
That's me.
My writer, my director, everyone's writer, everyone's director. I'm so excited to be doing this episode with you today. We have become quite close over the past year plus, I would say. So I took the opportunity to ask you to do an episode with me because I'm not only working with you, but I'm a great admirer of your skills. And so today we're going to talk about Contagion.
I remember that.
You remember that? So Scott, I rewatched it on Saturday. Holy shit. It was eerie how accurate your foretelling of what was to come was. And I know, just having worked with you over the last year, that you are someone who intensely researches and really gets to the bottom of things. And so I have to assume that that's why this movie felt like a precursor to what we actually lived through in the pandemic. But I don't want to put words in your mouth. I just want to understand how you managed to achieve this. It really was such a phenomenal movie, and, so well written, so well researched, so well directed. The acting was extraordinary. And I just want your opinions on all those things. But I want you to tell me where the seed of the idea started, and we'll go from there.
So the beginning of this journey for me was Steven Soderbergh and I had finished doing a movie called The Informant, and he came to me and said, "What do you want to do next?"
Was that the first time you guys had worked together on The Informant?
I had done a fair amount of work on Ocean's 12.
Okay.
So that was really the first time. But I had written The Informant prior to Ocean's 12. So
another brilliant movie. Okay.
Yeah. So Steven and I were kind of waiting on Matt Damon's schedule to clear. And he had promised De Niro that he would work on The Good Shepherd. And so he was off on that adventure. And we were waiting.
Okay.
And Steven pitched me an idea that was to do a movie about Leni Riefenstahl.
Okay.
That was going to be a kind of weird dark comedy in the spirit of Day for Night, like a movie about making a movie.
Okay, love it.
He called me and he said, I think I'd rather make a movie that people might actually see. So I thought, okay, I've put in a few months and I had done a great deal of research, and I'd watched Triumph of the Will like 2 or 3 times, which is not a healthy thing for a human being to do. And he asked me, in a way that he usually does ask these things. He was like, what else you got? And I said, my father had been fascinated by viruses and the potential for a pandemic for a pretty long time. He used to read the New York Times, sort of the back pages of the first section, and track things like, the bird flu just jumped into a human population. And he kept wondering, at what point would a thing be able to go from, in the case of bird flu, from bird to human to human to human? Because frequently viruses do jump from sort of what people in public health or in epidemiology would call the reservoir species into the human species. So I was familiar with that, but it's a lot of work for the virus to figure out how to go from the bird to the human, or usually there's a species in the middle. So it might go bird flies north over Latin America and it infects a pig's trough, and the pig now gets bird flu, and there are all these humans who work with pigs.
Right.
And so that happens. So that's a thing.
Okay.
That can happen. But it's like a lot more work for the virus to figure out how, once it's in that human, to go to other humans.
Okay.
That's like from going to Little League to going to like major leagues.
Right. Okay.
That was my understanding of it at that point. And I said to Stephen, I'd love to do a pandemic movie, but I would love to really make it science-based. I had always found the movie Outbreak to play a little fast and loose with the science. And, I don't know if you remember, but the end of Outbreak was basically, let's nuke the town to stop the spread of the virus.
I'm going to have to go back and rewatch that.
That seemed extreme to me.
Yeah. Just burn it all down.
It was interesting because Jeff Skoll, who at the time owned a company called Participant, found out that I was working on this project with Stephen, and Jeff had also put money into The Informant. And he said, that's one of my big 5 Skoll global threats.
Oh my God. So what year are we talking when you're like first sort of imagining this? 2008?
Yeah. And so Jeff said, I need to do that movie with you. And I said, well, Stephen and I sort of wanted to do it on our own, and then we would set it up. But Jeff was adamant, and I had worked with Participant on An Inconvenient Truth, and they had also helped us out on The Informant. And so I felt loyalty to Jeff, who I had become friendly with. I said, okay, so we made a deal. And the other interesting thing that happened was Alan Horn, who at the time ran Warner Brothers, Alan's wife, Cindy, shared Jeff's passion and anxiety about pandemic illness. And she had worked with some docs at UCLA who worked in the public health area. So I didn't know any of that at that time, but it ended up being very, very helpful. So I called Jeff, and he said, I just hired a guy named Larry Brilliant, who is a real human being, who is an epidemiologist in the Bay Area.
Read about him.
Yeah, Larry had been working on a program called Flu Near You at Google that was a way of tracking flu outbreaks. And Larry is a fascinating, lovely, very important human being in my life now, but in our world. I mean, Larry was part of a team of docs who saw the last case of smallpox leave the planet.
Wow.
So, and even the way that happened was strikingly beautiful. Larry fell in love with a woman who in the 60s went to India on a spiritual quest, and he followed her there. And Larry ended up sort of being told by his guru that his mission was to do this.
Wow.
And Larry had also been on Ken Kesey's bus. He was their doctor. He has a great story.
Oh my God.
There's a book that is about Larry called Sometimes Brilliant that is a wonderful read. Anyway, I went and met with Larry, and we talked about epidemiology, and we talked about pandemics and how these things happen, and about public health writ large. And he told me that the most important person, two most important people I could go and speak to were Ian Lipkin, who at the time was at the Mailman School for Public Health at Columbia University, and a woman named Laurie Garrett, who had written a book, who also lived in New York, called The Coming Plague. I went to meet with Ian, and I made a very basic promise to him. I said, I want to follow the science.
Right.
And what I need from you is the promise that you will tell me what is possible.
Right.
And it was a really interesting and important conversation in my life because, in a sense, the part of the brain that thinks about viruses and epidemiology and pandemics, I think in a way is similar to the part of the brain that considers story.
Interesting.
Anything can happen. And because there's so many of us, there's a reasonable chance that anything will. So Ian and I bonded over the similarities between storytelling and trying to come up with what is possible, but maybe not expected.
Wow.
And that intersected with the part of his brain that looks at what a virus might do. So we sat down and he taught me about a lot of different viruses, and I wanted to avoid things like Ebola that were sort of already very well known, because there's basically three versions of how viruses get loose in our lives. Mm-hmm. One is this concept called bioerror, where someone is messing around with a virus in a lab and somehow or another it gets out. And you might say, well, why would you even mess around with a virus in a lab? And the problem is there's research which is called gain of function research, where you'd kind of like to know if like monkeypox and smallpox met up with each other some dark night, what that might look like. And so can we get ahead of nature?
Okay.
By experimenting and trying to correct these things in a lab. And so that's what gain of function is. And there are all these biosafety levels that have been set up that's supposed to stop this from ever happening.
Yes.
Can it happen? Obviously it can happen.
Yeah.
You know, and Ian would say if he was here with us right now that you can't prove that COVID came out of a lab on the bottom of somebody's shoe, and you can't probably prove that it didn't. And so much like arguments for or against, you know, the existence of God, it's hard to prove either one definitively. And so I suspect we will stay stuck in this argument about COVID for a really long time, because it'll be hard to find a smoking gun or like the first species that showed up in a wet market.
Do you have a personal opinion?
I would be very, very upset to learn that it was a bioerror. And yet, you know, there are a lot of people like Alina Chan who have, you know, spoken to this. Ian is the most experienced person I know about these things. And, you know, he discovered the origins of SARS.
Wow.
He discovered the origin of a disease called MERS, which was Middle East respiratory syndrome.
Uh-huh.
Those are both things that are a little like COVID. They both came from nature.
Okay.
And one came from a camel, one came from, I believe, a civet cat in a wet market. And so I think Ian would say most of the time these things come from nature, and they come from the way our relationship with nature changes.
Okay.
And so, like, if you're in China and the custom is to get live critters at the wet market and take them home and butcher them, that's a real bad idea.
Yeah.
But it's part of their culture, and I'm sure they look at some of the things we do and think those are bad ideas. Anyway, that's what I think Ian would say if he was here, but I'm not convinced either way, to be honest. Like I said, I think it's one of those questions I'm comfortable not knowing the answer to, and that
It's kind of more horrifying to actually know.
Yeah, my energy and our energy is better spent keeping each other safe than assigning blame. In the case of the other two things, there's bioterror, and this is a real thing that someone could engineer a virus or redesign it using CRISPR technology or other things that exist in the world. And some very, very evil person could launch that into the world. That's very frightening to me. It's very frightening to the Department of Homeland Security.
Yeah.
They actually do tabletop exercises.
What does that mean?
They'll get a bunch of people who work in the infrastructure to do what, I wish I could record one, because they're a little bit like radio plays, like War of the Worlds.
Oh, wow. Wow.
You decide that someone has unleashed smallpox in Omaha, and what does everyone do, and how does the, Nebraska Health Department respond?
Wow. Uh-huh.
And then how does the CDC respond? And it becomes a tracer bullet through our Homeland Security and our health apparatus. And so they do these in, I don't know how much we want to talk about politics, but during the Trump administration, they decided to stop doing these, which was a big mistake. Like, I just don't understand why they didn't care enough about our safety to continue to run these sort of tests. And so, first they cut those programs and they defunded a lot of other things. And so one of the things we don't talk about is that the Trump administration disassembled a lot of what was in place to keep us safe. And that's striking and stunning, especially if you're a Republican, because those were programs that the Republicans really, really leaned into earlier in time, especially after 9/11, because we were very concerned about terrorist attacks.
That's fascinating.
The third way that we get these things is called zoonosis, and that means they're basically just coming from the natural world. Someone goes to a wet market, they decide they're going to eat an animal, and unfortunately, the night before, there had been a bunch of bats nesting above that animal, and that animal comes in contact with bats who have come in contact with the disease, and then it's like the monkey at the typewriter thing. Eventually, it's going to type Hamlet, and in this case, Hamlet's a little bit like Contagion.
So that was the most intriguing version to you, story-wise.
Yeah, for a number of reasons. One of them that, we don't ever really talk about, but people in the public health, world do talk about, is climate change. And as our relationship to climate changes, and as our footprint on the world gets larger and larger and larger, and we cut down old growth forests, we come in contact with things that we never have before.
Right.
And a bat has basically the same body temperature as you. So if a disease works in a bat,
wow,
it could work pretty well in you.
Oh, wow.
pigs have really runny noses. They tend to like get snot and saliva all over the people who handle them because we eat a lot of livestock. There's a certain percentage of the population that every day comes in contact with pigs.
I love this story brain. I'm so there for this narrative. I love this. Okay.
If it was summer, I might say a bug bite, West Nile. Herpes can cause encephalitis.
She doesn't have herpes. What are you talking about?
Okay.
What happened to her? What happened to her?
Okay.
Everyone's entitled to their own opinion. But some opinions are more useful than others. And we all want the good ones. The ones that shake things up, spark debates, and change minds. Financial Times readers know that their opinions are reliable because they're shaped by trusted journalism. Robust opinions, confident decisions. Source FT. To subscribe, go to ft.com/sourceft.
Somewhere in the world, the wrong pig met up with the wrong bat.
So I loved it. And, I loved it because it seemed like so many things were possible and problematic. And there were two main viruses that Ian told me about that we played with. One was called Nipah and one was called Hendra. And right now, because I am not an epidemiologist and it's been 10, 12 years.
Pretty close, though. I'm pretty impressed.
One of them affects like horses. And initially I had this idea this would start with a horse at a racetrack in Singapore, and that the horse had made its way there from Australia, and that someone had cut down a mango kind of grove, and the bats had found mangoes and eaten them and then dropped them where the horse's pasture. And the horse ends up licking, an infected mango pit. And then the horse doesn't feel good. And as someone who, had the opportunity in Minnesota when I was young to like meet some horses, what's the first thing you do when you meet a horse? You rub its nose and its face.
Yes.
So I liked that idea. I don't know why it lost interest for me, but I still watch the movie and think, would the horse thing have been more interesting?
I love what you chose. I love what you chose.
Yeah, I think what I was drawn to was the role of human behavior in creating enough time and enough spread. And this is where I think where life on Earth and virology really are parallel. It used to be that if the plague or something showed up in a village in Europe, it could only really spread as fast and as far as you could walk. So then we got planes, so now it can go anywhere, but we also got better at medicine. So we should also get better at stopping it. But we've also now become expert at politicizing misinformation.
Right.
So now we can, guide people down false narratives.
Right.
So the whole thing, in a way, maybe hasn't changed. And that was interesting to me.
So did you always know, Scott, that it was going to be these sort of multiple narratives explaining the sort of entirety of this issue, of this disaster?
Ever since I had seen Traffic, which Stephen had directed, I really wanted to make what I called a braided narrative, and he was receptive to that. I thought, I know this guy is really good with these kinds of stories.
Yes.
So I'm going to try and write one. The only way I knew how to do it, and I'm sure there are people who are much more thoughtful about this, is I had to basically write an entire movie for each narrative.
So talk me through that process. What does that look like?
A lot of note cards. But it's sort of like, if you've ever seen Stoppard's Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead,
sure,
you have to figure out what they're doing off screen. So I tried to figure out, okay, what is the Emhoff family doing when I'm not watching Matt Damon or their kid or,
Yeah.
Here's a weird Emhoff story.
Okay.
So the reason the Emhoffs are named that is I went to a school in Minnesota called Noble Elementary. And for a while, when I directed commercials, the woman who was my executive producer was named Kirsten Emhoff.
Okay.
She was married to a guy named Doug Emhoff. They got divorced. And as we now know, Doug Emhoff is married to Kamala Harris, which is just a bizarre coincidence.
So bizarre.
Yeah. So that's kind of where the Emhoff name came from. And the Minnesota thing was, I like writing what I know, and I was familiar with Minnesota, although we shot Chicago for Minnesota. I wanted there to be kind of this whole story of, Mrs. Emhoff's infidelity. And
I loved that.
Yeah, like what are the lies we tell in the face of infidelity?
Mm-hmm.
And how can those conceal someone's behavior and allow a virus to spread because people don't want to be honest? And so that was one storyline. And then the Jude Law character was someone that it was an idea that I had fallen in love with through Ian and Larry, where we talked about the role of misinformation in pandemics throughout history. And, there was a point in time where people felt that plague spread because of the Jews. And that later it turned out that people thought it was rats. Turned out it was a little mite that lived on the rats that got on ships, and that's how it spread. So I became very interested in the false narratives that surround the spread of disease and how they create their own kind of camouflage over reality that allows these things to penetrate a society. I mean, Laurie Garrett taught me that the Spanish flu likely came from horses and that the horses gave it to soldiers. I think Laurie may have proof of this, but they were soldiers stationed, I believe, in Kansas or somewhere in the central United States. And when they were shipped out to Europe, that really gave the virus the jump it needed to become a global pandemic. And so, it's kind of a misnomer that we call it the Spanish flu, because it may be the Fort Leavenworth flu.
Sure.
But again, very hard to prove, especially then. And I know when COVID happened, Larry and I would have conversations about the fatality rate of that. Like, I know it's published somewhere what it is, but how do we know that that's even accurate? What were we doing for science, and what was the reporting of illness? And again, it goes back to, were people able to isolate? Were communities less likely to see people come and go and take a disease with them? And then, like, the other big deal is, what is the mortality rate? Because initially when you show up for this kind of a movie, you're like, oh, I want to pick like the really scary, bad, dangerous thing. Like, lead me to the Ebola part of the world, because then I can make a very frightening movie.
Yes.
Turns out Ebola is a very self-limiting proposition because it kills so many people and so quickly that it tends to burn through a population.
So, Scott, you were armed with all this knowledge, and then you have to create a narrative that has the pace that Soderbergh's going to want. And so how did you marry like your knowledge and your sort of commitment to science with the style of filmmaking that you knew Steven was sort of would gravitate to? Like, I noticed you chose to kill off Gwyneth and the son very quickly, and that's a very fast acting.
Yeah, we wanted to really follow disaster movies. Steven and I spoke a lot about Poseidon Adventure, and that if you kill a big movie star in the first
Brilliant.
10, 15 minutes, people will lean into your movie in a different way. They'll feel like, oh, these people they're not screwing around. Nobody's safe in this movie.
No, it was such a brilliant choice.
And so that kind of informed a lot of what we would do. And, so there was, the killing of Gwyneth. And, there was a great moment when we went to Italy. We were at the Venice Film Festival and a reporter asked Gwyneth, did she feel she had been killed because she had an affair?
Ooh, wow.
And she sort of looked at the reporter and said, imagine if that were true. I wonder how many men would be dead here in Italy.
And that's why she's Gwyneth Paltrow.
Exactly. And then there were characters like Kate Winslet. And that was another really fascinating discovery. Like, I thought, like most people probably do, that the CDC is this big thing and it has, an outpost in every state or something. And that's not at all how it works. There are 50 different health departments, one for each state. They don't really share very much. The CDC can't even get involved unless they get invited in.
Ugh, that was wild.
Yeah. So that to me created a different kind of ticking clock. Like, there are places where the CDC would, of course, be invited in, depending on who the president is. There are other places where I can imagine right now that their health departments would say, we don't want anybody from the CDC near here.
Mm.
Kate did such a spectacular job with the whole R naught thing. And she was really so talented in terms of her commitment to wanting to understand every word she was saying.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And again, the decision to kill her is a thing. I mean,
right.
Whatever they are, EIS officers, epidemic investigative something scientists, I'm not sure. Again, I should have brushed up. But the people who get sent in to these situations frequently can die because they're wading into a swamp and they don't know anything about what they've signed up for. And they're trying to be investigators. I mean, interestingly, Ian and I have tried since Contagion to do a TV show where an EIS officer is at the center of it. And we haven't quite been able to do that. So I think, to answer your question, I saw all of these very unexpected points of tension. Who gets to go and explore? How can Kate Winslet work backwards fast enough to figure out what the hell happened before this disease spreads?
Mm-hmm.
How can she do this when you have someone profiteering like Jude Law, who uses social media to damage the reputation, of Lawrence Fishburne, who's running the CDC? And so all of these things, I sort of just wanted, it was like just keeping plates spinning.
But the thing I just have to say, and I have so many questions, because like your unique ability is to personalize these global stories, right? And so you do care about the family. You do care about Kate Winslet and her relationship to Lawrence Fishburne. And you do, I think that like the thing that makes this script so brilliant is that I felt it was an intensely personal story while dealing with like such a massive undertaking. I just feel like that's spinning plates. I don't even understand how you do it and how you keep it unique. Each storyline felt like it was like very much a life. And so I guess I just go back to your process and how much is it just you in a bubble figuring this out? And how much is it you workshopping with your director? Just talk to me a little bit more about that. I need to get under the hood.
Stephen and I have sort of a natural tension between us. I just did a television series on Apple called Extrapolations. And I remember sending Stephen the second episode to get his opinion. And he wrote back to me, I know one of your goals is to make people cry. Congratulations. And, I also want to make people laugh and think and do other things. But,
Yeah.
I think it was a weird compliment, but I'll take it from him.
I would take that.
So I think for me, I tended to want to get into the personal lives of these people. And, Michael Shamberg and Stacey Sher, I think, supported that. And I think we became a very good balance between creating that kind of emotional place while Stephen was, we always talk about, do we want to go home with the characters? And in this, because a lot of them were being quarantined, we did want to go home. I mean, the Emhoffs were trapped in their home.
Yes.
The hypervigilance of Matt's character is really coming out of COVID, such a poignant thing.
Completely.
The choices you make in terms of your isolation, and especially if you have a kid.
Yeah.
As he did, and you had 2 kids and you lost one. To me, the big moment is when his daughter sneaks out and he catches her.
Yeah.
And your anger about that crashes into your humanity and how I feel this way with my own, niece and nephews. How much, did they lose in those years? It's really sad. And, how do we give that back? So those sorts of things I really wanted to make space for. Or, for Marianne Cotillard's character, when she's kidnapped, to come in contact with this whole other culture. And there used to be more in that story. We shot Hong Kong first. And I think there were things Stephen and I realized that would have been, if we had the money to go back and do a little bit of additional photography there, I think we could have filled in a little bit more of what had to happen there, especially at the end, when Marianne is told that the vaccine that was offered to liberate her was counterfeit. I felt like I wanted there to be a little bit more of an emotional payoff there, but I think by then Matt's storyline had become so dominant in the movie that everybody felt like that's where we wanted to land the plane.
Right now, our best defense has been social distancing. No handshaking, staying home when you're sick, washing your hands frequently.
To go back to the balance between you two, when you say, I know one of your intents is to make people cry, are you sort of the emotional side of the brain and he's sort of the active side? Like, when you send him a draft, is he giving you notes or is he like, oh, this is great, you got, like, how does it work? I'm just so curious because you guys have had such a successful partnership.
He gives me a lot of notes, and I don't think either one of us would be comfortable saying that I'm more emotional in terms of my approach to film, and he's less so. I think we both share the desire for emotion. I think it really just becomes an issue of how you attain it and what is really the moment. When we were doing The Informant, I remember one of the producers sitting next to me saying, so is he going to go in for a close-up here? Is he going to go in for a close-up?
Mm-hmm.
And I would go and ask Greg Jacobs, I'm like, are we going to go in tighter than this?
Yeah.
And Greg would go, no. And finally, one night, I said to Stephen, just so I can stop having the same conversation every day, when do you think you're going to go in for a close-up? And he opened up his script and he went to a page that was, in the third act, and he had circled a scene. And he said, here. And if we go in, 5 times before then, it won't mean anything here.
Wow.
And, in that moment, I learned so much about grammar. And it's not that Stephen doesn't want to take close-ups of people.
Mm-hmm.
It's that he understands the tools in the box.
Right.
And that if you abuse them, they're not going to be there for you when you really, really need them.
And so does that imply that Stephen is sort of anticipating every shot before, you start shooting? Like he sort of plotted out the sort of visual approach so that he has thought about that close-up. It's just not going to be for 70 pages.
Yeah, I think it's evolved, because I don't think he would care that I'm saying this, but, when you see a Steven Soderbergh film and it says Marianne Bernard as the editor, that's Steven. So he's editing his own work. And when it says Peter Andrews for cinematographer, that's also Steven. So he's wearing all of those hats. And
I think I knew that intellectually, but when you said that, I was like, oh, all right. Those are made up people.
So
that's amazing.
What I've learned is that, he is shooting knowing he's going to be the editor. And so he has a very purposeful approach. On another movie that we did, Side Effects, I remember there was a scene with Jude Law in it. I was really happy with the way the scene was playing, and so was Jude. And we finished shooting Jude's half, and he said, "Okay, we got this." And I'm like, "But aren't we going to turn around?" And he's like, "I'll never use it," which he can make that decision.
Right, because he knows, because he's going to be the guy editing. Oh my God. So we can just like lose that on the day. It's like, oh, I see it. I see what it's going to be, and we don't need to waste their time with this.
And that was probably evolving all the way back to Contagion. And so I think he knew when we wanted to create a larger sense of panic, of, a society that was breaking down, and when that needed to be public and when we needed to be more engaged with the private moments. I think the discovery for us in doing that was just how spectacular Jennifer Ely was.
Loved her.
I had awareness of her, but I'd never worked with her. And Jennifer's ability to understand her dialogue and communicate it was just stunning. And we finished the movie and people, were like, is there more we can do with Jennifer? And the one thing that we did go back and shoot was this idea, and it came from a book that I think Ian had given me called Who Goes First, which is sort of the history of what people first take what they believe is going to be a functional vaccine. And frequently the scientists do that themselves, less so now. But we decided to introduce this character of her father.
Oh, wow. I'm going to cry. Seriously, that was so brilliant.
It was great. I mean, for me, it became really an important scene to write because there was, my own history with my father, and, it was an opportunity to explore a lot of those feelings. And, to Stephen's credit, he gave space for that.
Yeah.
So it was great. And she was spectacular.
Most writer-director relationships these days aren't the type that you and Stephen have. It seems like you write the script, but then you're very much a part of the production. Is that sort of how things work for you guys? Is that how it worked on this?
I mean, honestly, I didn't know that was unusual.
Mm-hmm.
I really didn't. He had always said, well, the script better than anybody else here. And so why should I remove you from the process? And if you suggest something that I don't agree with, or the actor doesn't agree with, and you are defiant and a baby, then your being here will probably become problematic for everyone.
Right.
I've never looked at the way I write that way. I was talking to somebody about this actually yesterday. I think there are directors in the world who are very good at creating something in their head and then going and pulverizing the world to make the world give them exactly that.
Yes.
When I think about Paul Thomas Anderson or the Coen brothers or David Fincher, I feel like they have such an incredible, vision and grip on what they're doing that they are able to wind up with something on film that looks probably like what they've had in their head for many months.
Right.
I'm not that person, and I don't know that Steven is either. He's told me he's not.
Mm-hmm.
I think for him, and I know for me, it's a negotiation with reality. It's like, what location kind of looks like what I had in my head, and what will my budget and my days allow for, and how do I get something that's as close as possible to what was in my brain on film. And then at some point you have to make a very difficult decision, which is, do I cling to this previous vision, or do I, kind of wake the fuck up and go, reality isn't giving me that today. So what else can we do here? What are the actors really telling me? And how you sort of navigate that space, without feeling like I've lost control of the movie and without feeling like I'm trying to beat reality up when it's clearly telling me to do something else. And I just watched a documentary about Jason Isbell, and he said a really great thing early on. He said, the fun part about recording a song is recording while the players are learning. Because that's when their creativity happens. And so not only are you getting the performance, but you're getting the creativity and the discovery of the performance, as opposed to things when they get over rehearsed and you're just getting a performance.
Does he not do a lot of rehearsal?
Not that much. When we were doing The Laundromat, there was a moment where there was a day player who found herself across the table from Meryl Streep. And I could tell the day player was nervous. And I really didn't want her to be nervous in the scene.
Right.
And no one was saying anything. And I said to Stephen, is it okay if I just go and talk to her about why I wrote what I wrote?
Oh, that's so great.
Which is generally all I feel if I'm the writer I have license to do, is just tell them why I did what I did. And I sat down with her, and my back was to Meryl, who I thought had left the set. And I walked her through everything. And I get up, and Meryl's right behind me. And she says, "That was very nice, Scott. How come you never do that for me?" So I
love
can't
that
remember
anecdote.
I can't remember what I said
story.
back to her, but
I'm sure it was pithy and perfect.
She's, Meryl's extraordinary. And the real lesson of that for me was Meryl wants to play.
Yeah.
Like my sense is there are people who are so intimidated by her that they don't get to really fully enjoy her or give her the space
right
to practice her craft.
That's so fascinating.
But like Stephen is always really, really generous with me about, go and talk to them about it. And I remember early on, I think on The Informant, saying to him, it was a scene with Matt, and I don't remember the scene exactly in the movie, but I said to him, oh shit, I think I said the wrong thing to Matt. And I felt really bad.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, we all need to have a conversation. Like I made it into a much bigger thing. And Greg Jacobs was the AD on that movie with Steven, and the three of us stood there, and I was like shaking with shame. And Steven said, well, you need to do that. That's why you're here. And if I don't like it and I see it, then we'll talk about it and we'll fix it.
That's amazing. Like, we're not curing cancer. Totally. It's like, let's just see what happens. It's okay. This is an artistic process.
Exactly. And that goes back to, again, to like, are we throttling reality and trying to squeeze from it a couple of precious drops that we, and it sounds like I'm knocking that. And believe me, I'm not. Like, if I could do what David Fincher could do, I would be doing that.
Yeah.
And here's one of the weird things, like David and Steven really like each other, and their processes could not be more different.
Very different.
And yet they have a lot of respect for what each other does. So go figure.
Just to back up just a little bit, just to get a couple of the facts in place. You finished writing the script. Like, what happened? How did it get set up? Like, was it already something that Skoll was committed to? Like, how did that process get underway and casting and that kind of thing?
So this is one of my favorite stories. So Stephen and I walk in with the script, and Stephen and Greg had already started reaching out to Matt Damon and to Gwyneth and to Kate Winslet and Fishburne. And so we were building this pretty impressive cast.
Without being fully financed.
Unbelievable. It was basically getting participant to, I think, back the authors on some sort of cursory level.
Got it.
So we walk in and, Stephen says, so like, you have to pitch this because nobody knows how to spin all the plates other than you. So you got to go and do this. And I'm like, okay. He goes, just one thing. And this remains a joke between the two of us. He'll say at the end, no matter what you've said, just remember that the last thing that you say to them is, so really, it's a story about hope.
So every movie.
And I looked at him and I'm like, it's a pandemic. We're killing like a lot of people here. Like, it's, it's Poseidon Adventure.
Oh my God.
For this to work, we have to make it scary. And we were very sober about what that meant. And Sue Kroll at the time, who was running marketing at Warner's, came up with a great tagline, which is nothing spreads like fear, which I, as a former advertising person, just admired the brilliance of that.
Yeah.
And then again, having Alan Horn go home to Cindy Horn, at that point, I knew that Cindy Horn was very involved in pandemic illness work.
Sure.
I think he felt that this was a really good opportunity to do now I'll say this, I don't think I would have said it in the moment, but I was trying to Trojan horse a disaster movie, because by the time I had finished writing it, I'd become so taken with what public health means. I remember Laurie Garrett saying to me, when you see an Asian person on an airplane and they're wearing a mask, what do you think? And I very foolishly thought, oh, like maybe they're sick. And she said, that's actually not culturally what's going on. They don't want to get you sick. And what I find so important, and how I so wish this had been the lesson of COVID, was that it was one of the rare opportunities in our lifetimes where we could show our compassion and our love for our neighbors.
Yeah.
And we fucked it up. And it's really, really upsetting that if you just go back and think about the bitter arguments about schools, the bitter arguments about science, all of the things that became confrontational, and reimagine them as part of a cooperative enterprise where we, the humans who live in this country, could have decided that our job was to protect our neighbors.
Yeah.
I don't know why that idea didn't work, didn't hold sway. It is, the most profound religious idea.
Yeah.
It is the most profound societal idea. It's what we owe our children. And like, how did that get hijacked into, all of these other sorts of sick and twisted narratives, going from our condemnation of science and, what you need to understand about science is it's what we know right now. And we don't give up. We continue to push and learn more, but we give our best guidance in that moment to each other. I don't think that that's sick or twisted.
The Food and Drug Administration is accelerating approval of the MEV-1 vaccine currently in production at 5 secret locations in the U.S. and Europe, saying the first doses could be available for human use within 90 days.
Hey Ryan, that was a fast trip. It was like you teleported.
Yeah, just got in. I'll get all my expenses logged, I promise.
Oh, no, you're okay. SAP Concur uses advanced AI, so your expense report will practically write itself. Quite the breakthrough. It's like we've been teleported into the future.
All right.
So, just curious, would you give us written permission to convert your matter into energy patterns and reassemble you at, say, random travel destinations?
Margaret, are you building a teleporter?
No. Yes.
SAP Concur helps your business move forward faster. Learn more at concur.com.
Everyone's entitled to their own opinion. But some opinions are more useful than others. And we all want the good ones. The ones that shake things up, spark debates, and change minds. Financial Times readers know that their opinions are reliable because they're shaped by trusted journalism. Robust opinions, confident decisions. Source FT. To subscribe, go to ft.com/sourceft.
Hair thinning can happen for so many reasons. Whether it's stress or hormones or anything, at Nutrafol we've learned that real change starts below the surface. Our hair growth supplements take a whole body approach and target the key root causes of hair thinning, so you can see visibly thicker, stronger hair in 3 to 6 months.
Hair growth starts from the inside at Nutrafol.com. That's Nutrafol.com.
So instead, we lose spring, we lose summer, we lose another 144 days that don't happen again. Why can't they invent a shot that keeps time from passing?
Scott, I think about your movie and like the very nature of great film is this ability to sort of change hearts and minds, you hope, right? Like in our best version. And I think you really did that. And I was reading that during COVID, your movie sort of became biblical. Like people were like going to your movie to sort of figure out how to proceed. And how did you receive that? Like how wild must that have been? Because by the way, it was quite accurate. All the things you were suggesting were exactly the things we needed to be doing to a certain extent. And that is insane.
Yeah, I mean, look, there are a lot of things I can point out that were not completely accurate. I mean, and some of these are very in the weeds. The virus in Contagion is a paramyxovirus. COVID was not a paramyxovirus.
This is such a Scott Burns answer, by the way. You're like, no, Daniela, it wasn't that great.
And there are other things that are universally true. Like the very first lunch I had with that guy, Larry Brilliant, we ended up going to the bathroom after lunch at the exact same time. And I'm standing there at the sink, washing my hands after I ate. And I can't remember what we're talking about, but I get done and he goes, "You didn't wash your thumbs."
Oh my.
And I'm like, "What?" He goes, "I just watched you. You don't wash your thumbs." And I thought about it. I'm like, oh, I actually don't. I did this thing where I rubbed my palms together, but my thumbs were, they were not invited to the party. So things like that really stick with me. And those are the details that I wanted to put, into the movie as pieces of information that I think, really, really would help people. And I hope that did. it got very uncomfortable for me on social media for a while because, people started writing to me, accusing me of being Nostradamus or working for the CIA. And at one point it got really disturbing. And so I left.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
You left social media because of Contagion haters or people who thought you were?
Yeah. I mean, both people asking for advice, people thinking that I was involved with the CIA. It was just,
wow, Scott.
And again, you realize, like, I don't think we think enough about the math of our world and, what does a million people do, and they do a lot of different things. And so that was very uncomfortable. And the other part, which was probably even more uncomfortable, is every once in a while I would get a phone call from CNN or MSNBC, and people would ask if I would come on and talk about the movie and the pandemic. And I would say, okay, I'll do that, but I'm not an expert. And you really need to hear medical advice from a doctor, not a screenwriter.
Right.
Like, that's insane that you are even asking me. And they would say, but we've heard from doctors. And I made it kind of a rule. And I always brought Ian or Annie Ramoyne from UCLA, or Larry Brilliant, or Mike Osterholm from the University of Minnesota. Like, I always brought someone who knew this world.
Yeah.
Because I'm a screenwriter. And these segment producers would go, yeah, but it's just really exciting for people to hear from you. I'm like, that's not, I wrote a movie. I'm not an oracle. And if the movie's accurate, it's because I did something that I do think is vital, which is research and learn. And instead of tacking away from the research, tack deeper into it, because you'll find what you're looking for the deeper you go.
Scott, I adore you. You've imparted such wisdom. I'm serious. I'm really serious. You have cryptically referred to a spiritual successor to Contagion.
The spiritual successor, I didn't intend to do this, but I'm now going to hype my own podcast.
I love it.
So during pandemic, people had asked, would I do another one of these? And Stephen and I talked about it, and we felt like people were living it. They didn't probably want to go to a theater and see it.
Okay.
Then when AI appeared, I became very intrigued by the idea of the utility of AI as a public health tool.
Mm-hmm.
Could we involve AI in creating policy and figure out, like, wouldn't it be cool if we know where the next one of these was coming from? Sort of like the gain of function research, but without doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And then in talking about it with some tech people, some of whom were like, AI is bullshit. Other people who didn't feel that way, I thought, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to try and come up with an idea with AI, and then I'm going to try and write it with AI.
Oh.
Because my hypothesis going in is what I said to you at the beginning, which is the same need for story that a screenwriter requires is what an epidemiologist is searching for. And I want to see how that works with AI. So I think that's my spiritual thing, because it's, to me, it's about, it's what it's always about. It's about us finding like a cool story.
So have you executed on this?
I am working with it.
Okay.
Working on it with Audible.
Oh, cool. Oh my gosh. Okay. Stay tuned.
Yeah.
Breaking news.
Exactly.
Thank you so much. I adore you.
This was really, really fun. I haven't talked about this in a while, but I do think about it all the time.
Well, this will be your first, not your last. Thank you for doing this with me. I adore you. And we will be chatting very soon in any event.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Now let's go make something else. But thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Vanessa, that's Scott Burns. He's such a genius. I love just being in his presence because his mind works in a way that mine would hope to. And his ability to write this narrative is just testament to that. He talked about it being a braided narrative, which I think is probably the hardest type of script to write because you're writing, 6 or 7 different storylines that have to be fully developed and evolved and have nuanced characterization. And I was just so impressed with his ability to do that and also to play to Soderbergh's strengths, right? Like he had seen Traffic, he had seen Soderbergh's ability to really do a really effective telling of a story through that sort of multiple narrative concept. And he was like, all right, this is how I'm going to approach this global pandemic horror movie.
Yeah, it was so fascinating. I mean, I don't think I've ever heard the term braided narrative, and I love that now. And I think some of my favorite movies fall under that category because I think when it's done so well, and Contagion is done so well, it really feels like you're entering a world and it's not just following one person. It's not just following one character. You're kind of figuring out what this world that the writer has built and the director has made feels like and how other people are reacting to it. And it's something that I think when done effectively is so smart. And I think television is doing it really well. And it's kind of interesting to see that work in a feature, and Scott's so smart.
I really appreciated this movie when I first saw it. And now after speaking to Scott and rewatching the movie, I am so just impressed by his ability to pull this off with Soderbergh. And I think it's attributable to a few things. Number one, the amount of research this man did in order to create this narrative makes it feel all the more scarier, right? It's just everything he wrote could have happened. Obviously a lot of it did happen during COVID. And so that was so deeply impressive. And I think in watching it, it just felt so deeply rooted in truth that that's why it felt so scary. But then to sort of play with the strengths of Soderbergh as a filmmaker and also these really interesting decisions they made with character, like to kill Gwyneth Paltrow off in the first 15 minutes of the movie, those are just really bold, wild choices. And sometimes that works and sometimes it really doesn't work. Anyways, I'm just in awe of this movie in retrospect.
Yeah. Spoiler alert for those who haven't seen this movie.
Yeah. How old is this movie? I feel like it's okay.
2011. Yeah, no, it's fine. But it is crazy. It's crazy because I think we've all become very obsessed with epidemiology after COVID. And I think right now it feels like something that's really relevant. But at the time, it definitely was a niche subject. And it's interesting to see how they utilized that to their advantage and made it. I mean, Contagion in its time was still a really big movie. And the fact that it works today is just a testament to how accurate it is and how important research is. But I think when you're doing something that feels really bold and you're talking about a subject that sounds really boring, but you're making it feel so real. And I think there's something about and personalized, it feels so grounded and rooted in reality. And obviously now we know that this could really happen. So I think that it really pays off to do all that research and to do what they did and to be so bold.
100%. And I also loved, there's so many things I loved about this interview. One of which is, just the accuracy with which we started handling our own personal health, I remember in the early days of COVID, we didn't really know what to do. It was should you wear gloves? Should you be washing every surface that you come in contact with? Oh, masks are a thing. I just remember it day by day, you started to see all these tropes sort of in the world. And if we just watched the movie day one, we would have known exactly how to handle a breakout like this.
Crazy.
But the other thing I really loved was his observation of Soderbergh as a filmmaker, because Soderbergh is not only the filmmaker, but he's this, the DP and the editor. He does it all himself.
That's great.
And so, which in and of itself is insane, but the mark of a true genius. And he sort of pitted him against other filmmakers who are a lot more sort of entrenched in the way that they make films. Like I'll cite Fincher as an example of that. He sort of talked about Soderbergh's process as a lot more organic and like open to the process of the day. And I just loved hearing that you can have multiple ways to create great art, you know, like every filmmaker has their own way of achieving greatness. And I don't know, for some reason that just made me really happy, you know?
Yeah. I think we work in a business that's a team sport, and it is amazing and really encouraging to hear that a filmmaker like Soderbergh makes that process so inherent to how the movie gets made. It's not about this is me, this is my movie. And like you would think that if he's taking over all of those different positions, that that's what it would feel like. But it is quite the opposite. It feels like he's like, we're just going to get this thing made and we're all going to work together and no idea is a bad idea.
Like even having Scott on set for all of the films and having him as a like constant collaborator, like Scott was right there, you know, that doesn't happen anymore. That's pretty unusual. And so I really love that. I love this movie so much, despite it being a reminder of a time we all want to forget. But that was a great one. It was a really, really informative, amazing interview. So thank you, Scott Burns. And loyal listeners, hopefully we'll be seeing another of Scott's brilliant pieces of filmmaking very soon in the future with us, with Stay Gold.
With us. We're bringing it to life.
I know, as we speak. So Vanessa, that was another good one. Let's do the wrap up.
Let's do it. You guys have to like and follow and subscribe.
Don't forget to subscribe. It's so important.
You have to subscribe. It really, really helps us. It helps us be able to bring you guys the best content and the best interviews.
We sound like the New York Times right now. I love it. It's just us in the daily, just trying to survive.
Out here begging you guys to subscribe.
Yeah.
Go on our website, staygoldfeatures.com, and look at our merch and get yourself a sweatshirt or a t-shirt. Follow us on Instagram at Hollywood Gold Podcast. And that is all.
That's sort of it. And don't forget to
stay gold. The part I always forget.
You're getting quicker though. By next week, it'll be immediate. All right, guys.
I don't know why I can't remember this spiel, but like and subscribe.
All right, guys. Love you and stay gold.